Great. So, good afternoon. And first of all, I want to say what a great honor it is to be here. It's wonderful to see everyone. Let me begin with two different images. And the first image is that of a vertical barbell. So imagine if you're holding this barbell, the top and the lower layers are quite well represented, but the middle is quite thin. And this image actually captures what many people refer to now as the China paradox. The paradox is after decades of unprecedented growth and incredible transformation, there's still unbelievable disparity. And I want to juxtapose that image with the image of an onion. And you go, why an onion? Well, this is actually the image of society that the Chinese government wants to shape. One in which the middle layer is actually quite rotund, and they want the top and the lower layers, echelons of society, to not be as like the barbell. So I bring up these two very different images because this is an intensive state project. It's not just one of economics, it's actually one also of cultural and political changes. Now, in 2011, just 2 years ago, the Chinese Academy of Social Science put out this figure that estimated the middle class to be about 230 million. And this represents about 37% of the urban population. Now, what's interesting about this figure is that this is actually double what it was about a decade ago. So in the year 2000, it was roughly half. And so within a decade, it's jumped by 115. Now, what's even more spectacular is that by 2020, however, the Chinese government estimates that they want to fill up the middle of the onion 800 million people. It's a huge figure. Not only is it 10 times bigger than the current middle class in the UK, but it's actually, if you think about the United States population, that's over 2.5 times the US population. So when I was living and working in China as a VIA volunteer in the mid-1980s, it was very hard to imagine such a scenario. Many of the students I was working with were just returning to campuses that just reopened. And when you read their essays, when I read their essays talked about many years of interrupted studies where they were not able to go back. A lot of my students were older than I was, in their late 20s to early 30s. They also described family separation. And what was very interesting, they also described this desire for national progress. So the other thing that's interesting to note was that the hukou system, the system of residency, which kept everyone in place, only 80% of the population were allowed to be in the rural areas and 20% allowed to be in the cities. So if you were a student in the university system, it was actually quite a privilege to be there. And many of the students that I worked with were very, very grateful. And it was precisely their experiences and the stories of their families that really propelled me to go on to graduate school to really actually focus on mental health for my research. It was actually, ironically, in the psychiatric wards and in the clinics, the inpatient clinics, that I really gained a deeper understanding of the material and social changes that were introduced over the past 30 years. So given these changes, given these numbers that I've narrated to you, what are the projections of an immediate future? Well, not surprisingly, many scholars and policymakers are focusing on consumption. And I want to talk very briefly about the nexus between oil, water, and food, which is one way to think about consumption. So with gross domestic product in China growing basically between 8 to 10% each year, China's need for energy is also growing at about the same pace. So every year it's about 7.5%, such that by 2020, its need for consumption is going to jump by 150%. This is actually 7 times higher. The 7.5% growth in consumption of oil is actually 7 times higher than that of the US. Now, if we look at water, by 2030, the government has actually projected that all of the country's available water supplies will have been used up. And that's a pretty dire fact if you think about that already in the current moment, 90% of the groundwater is actually contaminated. So it's a pretty intense picture. And then even more significant, if we look at food, anyone who's read any of the newspapers or media, whether Chinese or Western, cannot help but notice that there have been incredible concerns about food safety in terms of contaminated food sources, but also fake foods as well. So, for instance, milk formula, etc. And even last month, the story of over 12,000, not just 10,000, but 12,000 dead bodies of pigs floating down the river really is really testimony to the implosion of the food system currently in China. So I've described a very dire, very intense picture of current matters that China is facing. And this is not just the middle class, this is everyone. This is especially ordinary people and those who are working, struggling to try to get into the middle class at the moment. So as an anthropologist, but also as someone who's lived and worked there, how do I make sense of this, in particular, very dire scenario? And what I'd often turn back to is very much my initial years as a VIA volunteer. I think about my experiences, but more importantly, the students and the families and the friends I made in their lives and how they have changed. Because as they've weathered these extraordinary changes, their experiences are really the barometer that I turn to. And it's not just their experiences, but also the quality of resiliency. This is the quality that I'm very interested in as an anthropologist now. How do people survive, and how do they survive in incredible transformations? I realize now that the stories that many of these people shared with me as a 20-something Chinese American, just out of college and very, wide-eyed and not very knowledgeable about the mainland China, I realized these were deeply invaluable, not just because they were personally significant and meaningful to them, but really taken together, their stories, these narratives constitute a social fabric of what is possible, how to survive and how to thrive even in the face of unimaginable changes and vulnerability. Thank you.